This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website to help you stand out and succeed online, but more on them later. So if you follow my channel, you know my usual bread and butter is talking about modern stainless steel sports watches from brands like Rolex, Omega, Cartier. But today, I want to take a break from that and talk about watches that are actually better to buy vintage and look at some of the best value in the secondary world. Starting with Omega, I am a massive fan of Omega. I love a lot of their modern catalog offerings, and I massively respect their wide-scale adoption of the coaxial escapement. I actually don't talk enough about how big of a risk that was for them as a brand, the wide-scale adoption of coaxial, but that's a video for another time. For vintage Omega, I think the best starting place and some of the best value is found in the Constellation. More specifically, 1950s and 1960s Constellations. So, the Constellation was first introduced in 1952, and it got its name from the emblem on the caseback, which showed an observatory with 8 stars above it, each star resembling a special occasion for the brand. 1950s and 60s Constellations specifically do it for me. Generally 34mm to 37mm in case size, which were the normal men's sizes for the time. These are classic, beautifully done, with dogleg lugs, pie-pan dial, reliable automatic movements, and the price is fantastic on these, usually between $1,000 USD and $5,000, depending on material and condition. The modern Constellation doesn't do it for me, but the vintage ones are fantastic and a great way to get into vintage. Moving on to Rolex. Vintage Rolex is a minefield, and people really get into the weeds with these. I'm not as deep into it. I'm just trying to get a modern celebration dial before they discontinue it. That's where I'm at. But with vintage Rolex specifically, I love the bubble backs for something unique, the vintage day dates for classic Rolex, and the Explorer 2 reference 1655 for professional. Starting with the bubble backs, these are as charming as it gets. Rolex produced this model from 1933 through to the mid-1950s, and these were actually incredibly collectible in the 1980s, but have since fallen out of fashion with modern collectors who largely favor sports watches. You can generally pick these up sub $5,000, even sub $3,000 USD, and they're a fantastic piece of Rolex history. I actually might buy myself one of these. If I have a good year, if money's right, I would love to add one of these to my collection. For more classic Rolex, I mean, you can't beat the day date. When you look at the vintage models, they look absolutely identical to the modern models. Like when we say Rolex is evolutionary, not revolutionary, it's generally true, but the day date didn't even evolve. A lot of the vintage day dates tend to be sub $15,000 USD, which isn't cheap, but considering these retail for about $40,000 USD, I'd be very tempted going vintage if I was in the market for something solid gold. And lastly, a professional sporty model, the Explorer 2, and specifically the reference 1655. I think these are so special, so charming. I'd take these over an Explorer 1016 all day, every day. Very sporty. I love the color pop in the dual time hand. Once again, these aren't cheap, so they tend to hover between $20,000 USD and $30,000 USD, depending on condition and dealer. But if you have that kind of money and an interest in vintage Rolex, that's where I'd be going. Let's talk about Longines now. They're actually one of my favorite brands, and I should talk about them more than I do. To me, they're that transition zone between affordable luxury and mid-tier luxury, rich history, beautiful watches. I honestly don't have a bad word to say about Longines. When it comes to vintage Longines, the first place the mind goes is to their chronographs. A lot of people aren't aware that Longines was one of the first brands to develop a truly in-house chronograph movement in the 1920s with the caliber 13 ZN or ZN, which is also dang good looking, a truly beautiful movement. But although Longines is synonymous with vintage chronographs, they are very, very expensive with a logo collector's market. You can find some real value in models like these, all sub $1,000, smart, dressy, and timeless. For something a bit more off the beaten trail, maybe something like this, the Munich Olympics 1972 monopusher in stainless steel. It's just weird and classic, and I don't think you're going to bump into someone wearing the same watch. Should we talk about Squarespace? I think we should talk about Squarespace right now, and they also just happen to be today's fabulous video sponsor. I have been using Squarespace for years now. They are the best way to make a website for whatever you're doing. Whether it is for your podcast, blog, publication, maybe a little one-pager for your brick-and-mortar shop, Squarespace has you covered. They have hundreds of award-winning templates to fit your unique aesthetic. If you want something bright and bold, bam. Hit him with an example, Brittany. Yeah, there it is. Or maybe something minimal and clean. They've got that too. So I've been using Squarespace for my side project, which is writing about watches and maybe making a little publication. It's taking me a while to get to the place where I'm ready to publish. But you can't rush genius. They have this thing called Design Intelligence, which combines AI technology and Squarespace design expertise to build a website tailored to your specific needs even more quickly. It's quick, it's easy, it's using AI technology the way it's meant to be used, but everything is still completely customizable, so you can change and tweak anything that isn't quite right. If you are selling anything, Squarespace Payments is the easiest way to manage all your payments, all in one place. Plus, they give your customers so many ways to pay, including direct debit, Apple Pay, Klarna, Afterpay if you're in the US or Canada, and ClearPay in the UK. Squarespace is awesome. You need to try them out. Head to squarespace.com/BritPierce for a free trial. And then, when you are ready to launch, use my code, the BritPierce code, to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Go check them out, and thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. It's a Brit Pierce video, so of course we're going to talk about Cartier. I love the vintage Cartier world, and although you can't find the same amount of value that you could find in, say, vintage Omega, there's a real special charm to vintage Cartier, and that's why they are still so sought after and have a passionate collector's market, and they hold value. Of course, you have your Cartier Santos Galbés and Carrés, which are on my list. If you're not as familiar with these models, it's a little bit in the deep weeds of Cartier collecting, but the differences are notable. So the Galbés have a more curved and contemporary case shape, softer lines, less angular than the Carrés. The Carrés is a more classic traditional Santos case design with a square and angular case and bezel. For a long time, I would have said IWC isn't really my wheelhouse, but in the last few months, I've been really getting into them and going down the rabbit trail. So I recently bought an IWC Aquatimer 2000, circa the 1990s, and I can see myself adding more IWCs into the fold. Yet another brand where you can find some real value in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for some classic-looking timepieces. My personal favorite in vintage IWC is the Yacht Club 2, massively underappreciated model. Designed by Gerald Genta and released in the 1970s, this has all the mid-century integrated stainless steel characteristics so many people are looking for without that typical Genta price tag. There are a few different variations of the Yacht Club 2, but for that Genta look, it is actually the quartz you're going to want to be looking at. This is from the quartz crisis era where a lot of Swiss watch brands were just trying to stay in business and to be competitive. I think this is a great piece of IWC history, and I would love to own one of these one day. Jaeger-LeCoultre is one of my favorite brands. Their heritage is unrivaled. They have designed some of the coolest watches, and they are that next step up in terms of pedigree from brands like Rolex. This is another fantastic jumping off point and starting place for vintage. If you want something pretty odd and different, maybe something like the Futurematic. So this watch had a short production period from 1951 to 1959, and it is the first watch ever to appear without a winding crown, making a completely circular case. But to like and want a Futurematic takes a fairly unique and niche purchaser. For something a bit more sporty and general, it has to be the Memovox. So this has an alarm complication, and it was the first automatic winding alarm wristwatch. The functionality is cool. It is aesthetically cool. I should buy one. I think I could make an entire video about this watch and how much I love it. These tend to be between $2,000 and $5,000 going secondary. Never a bad choice. And lastly, for JLC, this is another one that needs a pretty niche buyer, but I can't not mention it, the Odysseus. Not the ALS Odysseus, the JLC Odysseus. Two very different things. I've talked about how much I love neo-vintage Breguet several times on the channel now. One big piece I'd like to buy at some point in my life is a Berthier Classique. If money is really good, a classique chronograph with a Longines movement, but that might be dreaming. I'll just be happy with a Berthier Classique. For this section specifically, I really want to hone in on the Daniel Roth era of Breguet and revival of the Breguet name. So in the 1970s, the Chaumet family acquired Breguet and were attempting to restore the watchmaking name to its former glory. It is in this time that a very young Daniel Roth was plucked away from Audemars Piguet to help restore Breguet. Under Roth and Francois Baudet, a Chaumet executive, they created the style that we now know Breguet for, staying true to classical watchmaking and specifically Breguet's artistic style, techniques, and inventions. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with modern Breguet. I think watch enthusiasts simp a little bit too hard for Breguet because of their name and because of Abraham Louis Breguet's importance and contribution to watchmaking. I always tell people, remember, these watches aren't made from the hands of Abraham Louis Breguet. And although that is true, I think Roth era Breguet is about as special as it gets for somewhat modern watchmaking and not getting actual Breguet pocket watches. And lastly, we need to talk about Vacheron Constantin and the amazing watches you can get going vintage and neo-vintage. Everything inside of me wants to ignore the Overseas and the 222, but there is something so special about mid-century Vacheron sports watches. I particularly have a thing for the first generation Overseas, not Gen 2. Gen 2 is never the answer, but Generation 1, yes. Now, I wouldn't say these are great value. They are expensive for what they are, but I have such a thing for them. I'd love to own one of these one day, very distinct. If you are looking for better value, I love Vacheron dress watches, but I find the 70s and 80s to be a bit awkward for VC. I'd go modern, like a 2010s Patrimony, amazing value. You're then getting applied indices, but still that classical, minimal design language. And there you have it. Those are my top recommends going vintage. Did I miss the best vintage watches ever? I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below. Are you a vintage geek? Let us know everything in those comments down below. Thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. And if you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe and subscribe to this channel forever. Now, Pope tier patrons, get their names on the screen. As always, these amazing names on the screen, they are the Pope tier patrons. They are so fabulous, so good looking. They have never sinned ever before in their life. So that's what happens when you become a Pope tier patron. But for real, thank you so much to the names on the screen. You keep the lights on here at Gringa HQ. And I really hope you keep enjoying my weird little channel. I love making these videos, and I'm glad people enjoy them too. Okay, bye guys.